everyone. Thank you for being here. Good to see you all. Welcome to our second Human Rights in Practice event of the semester, Messaging for Social Change, organized by the Duke Law International Human Rights Clinic and the Center for International Comparative Law, also co-sponsored by the Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I wanted to make special mention, we're especially grateful for a record number of student organizations co-sponsoring the event today. And so I will name them all. They are APALSA, BALSA, the Human Rights Law Society, the Duke Immigrant and Refugee Project, the International Law Society, LALSA, MENALSA, NELSA, SALSA, and the Women of Color Collective. I'm very excited to introduce our speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. And so we'll start with Geneviève Sauberly, who is joining us from Geneva. Geneviève is a passionate human rights advocate working at UN Human Rights, where she provides expert advice on migration and human rights. Over the past years, she's driven the office's work on shifting narratives on migration, working with partners across the globe to develop a toolbox on migration narrative change and bringing it to life through the hashtag Stand Up for Migrants campaign. Other areas of her work focus on the human rights protection of migrants in vulnerable situations, human rights monitoring in the context of migration, and developing capacity building tools on human rights and migration. Before joining the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, she worked with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission in Belfast, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe, and the Embassy of Switzerland in Vietnam. And next we'll hear from Catherine Otto, who is a strategist helping organizations of all kinds develop culturally sensitive, equity-advancing social impact approaches, narratives, and content. Catherine joined the company Purpose in 2016 to lead impact strategy on projects using culture, brand, messaging, and activation. Catherine is the founder and head of Purpose's Racial Equity Impact Practice, which leads the company and its partners in prioritizing equity for people of color and other marginalized groups in its social impact work. Catherine's Purpose portfolio covers issues including criminal justice, public health, the arts and media, access to play and sport, housing and security, and more, all with a mindful equity lens. And prior to her role at Purpose, Catherine worked in the music industry in a range of marketing, communications, and management roles. And finally, we'll hear from Richard Gaines, who is a human rights and international security professional working to alleviate human suffering by uplifting the voices of those confronting injustice in the name of hardship and persecution. He brings more than 10 years of experience in foreign policy and foreign assistance to bridge the gap between activism and government and to influence policies that promote human rights. Richard currently serves as a senior human rights advocacy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation, where he advances the foundation's values and policy positions around freedom of expression, access to knowledge, privacy, and censorship, while defending knowledge as a human right. Before joining the Wikimedia Foundation, Richard worked at the U.S. Department of State, leading a portfolio of foreign assistance programs and contributing to foreign policy initiatives, advancing human rights and democratic governance throughout Latin America, focusing primarily on Cuba and Venezuela. More recently, he concluded a stint in the private sector, where he managed international security programs for Delta Airlines, including the company's participation in the resettlement of Afghan refugees in August 2021 as part of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet program. So please join me in welcoming our three speakers, and I will now turn it over to Geneviève.
Can you all hear me okay? Not just waiting for something. So thanks so much to the Duke for inviting me, and I'm really sad that I can't be with you there in person, but I'm still very excited to be able to virtually and share a little bit of our work at UN Human Rights on
Geneviève, sorry to interrupt. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. It sounds like there's a bit of an echo and muffling.
Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe I should be closer to the mic. Does that work?
That's so far a little bit better. Let's try.
Um, Otherwise I can change my headphones if you prefer. That have like a attached microphone, it might be easier.
Yeah, if you're able to use your headphones, that might be better. I think it's still feeling a little patchy.
Yeah, sorry, we also have really terrible internet. Just give me a sec.
Okay, no worries.
Please say yes.
Can you say a little bit more?
Can you hear?
Yes, that's better.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about our work on narrative change on migration. But maybe taking a step back, as I mentioned, we do obviously a lot of work that is much more traditionally focused on identifying human rights violations against people with an experience of migration, documenting and reporting, monitoring, all with a view to, achieving legal and policy change. And the messaging piece is somewhat new or novel in that regard, because usually communication is not seen as a human rights issue, right? But what we have found is that, and this is, I think, no secret to you all, that, a lot of the harmful language and imagery that we see around migration actually does impact migrants' human rights. And a lot of these narratives that have become dominant across the world really risk normalizing the view and even the belief that migrants don't belong, that they don't have the same human rights, and that also then leads to these moves towards justifying restrictive migration policies and criminalization of migration as well. So for us, it has become part and parcel of our human rights work to look at how do we shift these narratives away from fear and hate towards something that is more human rights based. Now, I won't talk too much about what narratives are and how they come to be, because that probably take forever as well. But I think what is clear is that, you need a lot of stories to make up a new narrative. So in order to actually achieve that, it'll take a lot of time. And I'm sure other colleagues will talk about that as well. But we also need to kind of reach a broader audience beyond our human rights bubble, and encourage them to be part of this cause. So it means also moving away a bit from the legalese towards something that is much more emotive and speaks to people, resonates with them. And one thing we often say in our capacity building sessions is that, Martin Luther King didn't stand up there and inspire people by saying, I have a policy recommendation. So that's kind of where we want to start, is basically to inspire and tell a news story. And we use a storytelling approach, which means, trying to tell stories that are much more nuanced when it comes to migration and not so black and white, to hear from migrants themselves and amplifying their voices naturally, and drawing people in based on shared values and hope. And here, just to say as well that, the starting point as well is to understand how can we avoid perpetuating harmful narratives of fear and division. So one thing, for instance, we wouldn't do is we don't really rebut
statements or myth bust, because this can reinforce the problem, right? So if we say no human is illegal, the brain actually doesn't process the negation, it just focuses in on the illegal bit. So we're actually reinforcing the idea that people could be illegal, and that's definitely not what we want to be saying. So really, the 5 shifts that we work with as kind of our foundation here are really trying to move towards then contributing to strengthening a narrative that really builds on hope and inspires hope and inclusion, as well as collective action towards our cause, and shows really that we have much more in common, that we are part of a bigger, larger us and a human family. And one of the reasons we do that as well is because research has shown that people are much more likely to act and be supportive of our cause if they're shown what the change that we want to see looks like, right? If that's something that they can feel, how they could be part of it and what potential it holds. And so, as I mentioned, in 2020, we published the Toolbox on Narrative Change, which really is a 7-step guide on how to communicate differently on migration, but it also tries to bring to life that narrative and showcase, actually this is already happening in many places. It's just on a small scale. So how do we elevate this and make this bigger and part of our everyday rather than an exceptional instance? And in our activities, we obviously run the Stand Up for Migrants campaign, helping colleagues and other partners to bring that to the local level and contextualize it as well. And to showcase the activities, as I mentioned. And here are just a couple of examples I wanted to share. You can find much more on our website as well, including all the videos and the, podcast series, etc. But this is an interesting one. It was My Great Story was run in Australia last year, and Dari Dapur will be launched next month in Malaysia. Both of them are based on research with quantitative and qualitative research with our target audience to better understand what are their concerns around migration, what are their values, what are their interests even. And they both focus in on food as a connector, as an entry point. And it's not about, food is great because migrants make our food much more tasty and they contribute to our societies in that way. It's really much more about how do you use food as a common interest, a shared interest that shows people we have more in common, but it also helps them see how conversations around migration don't have to be polarizing and politicized. They can be about what we care about in our everyday lives, like our kids, we want a good education for them, or we want to be able to go to work and not fear, being deported at the next corner. So, talking about migration in a way that is much more humanizing and hones in on those shared values that are also reflected in our human rights framework. And here, just a few more examples, more cooking in Switzerland as well, where migrant women chefs have been giving cooking classes quite successfully in the cookbook, where you can also read about their stories. And in Mexico, we had a migrant illustrator run workshops with the locals and migrants to talk about what does migration mean to them and what are their hopes for that. And that resulted in them painting a mural together called Camino de Esperanza, which the video of which you can see online as well. And it's also been showing in in the Mexico City subway stations in the past week. So it's also been a really exciting opportunity to bring that kind of work to a much broader audience as well. And yeah, here's just a few more examples of how, we work with many different artists, comedians, different topics, and just to try and reach people in different ways and in ways that is less aggressive, if you like, that brings them in, draws them in to then question also a little bit what they might have heard up to now on migration. And yeah, so I just wanted to close to say that, these are things that have now also been integrated in the rest of our work. And I think particularly when we work on borders, it's so important to think about how do we portray people at borders and borders themselves, so that we don't further victimize, don't further dehumanize people on the move, but that, show them in a way that upholds their dignity and that can also inspire a different understanding of what a border is to most people, and that, moves away from that kind of securitized approach. We obviously continue to try and understand, the problems and also integrate, what are the systemic issues in our narratives work, but also in our, when we work on other themes, but trying to also integrate in that, what kind of solutions can we propose and how do we get there? And yeah, finally, just to again show that, we have much more in common. I think the human rights language hasn't been always welcomed by many people, but as I mentioned before, a lot of the values that underpin them, justice, good education, a safe house, a home to live in, I think those are all things that people understand. And when we speak about them in that way, we can also make it less about, it's us versus them. And we can explain that actually, when you give more human rights to one group, it doesn't mean you're detracting human rights from another group, but that you're actually increasing human rights protection for everyone. So I think that's really us in a nutshell, but I hope to speak more about this with you, and I look forward to other panelists' interventions. Thank you so much.
To attempt to be technical. I think I can manage a remote. My name is Kat Otto. My pronouns are she, her, and as Aya mentioned, I am a social impact strategist. So I look at messaging as a strategic lever within a mix of advocacy actions that an organization, or a nonprofit, a philanthropy, a business, a coalition, perhaps a political group might take to advance or realize a social change goal. So usually I'm looking at messaging, which I'll use probably interchangeably with phrases like perception change, narrative change work, just this whole body of work that's about influencing hearts and minds, changing levels of awareness, changing preconceptions or misconceptions, beliefs. I'm usually thinking about messaging on two planes. So as mentioned, I'm thinking of it first and foremost as a change-making tactic. Geneviève made a really salient point that gone are the days of thinking about messaging as sort of like an afterthought or a nice to have. It is absolutely imperative and part of your advocacy mix. And then I'm also thinking about it as an ethical practice. So how messaging in and of itself, storytelling, can be used to advance pro-social ideas that are constructive towards your social change goal in the short term, but also more broadly, the kind of value sets and rights that I think all of us are interested in. So just starting on the first bit, messaging as a change-making tactic, the core question that you're usually asking yourself here is twofold. So it's kind of an offensive and defensive posture. So what stories on the offensive will help you advance your social impact goal? What messages or ideas do you need to put out there proactively to bring along the right stakeholders and audiences in your objective. And then conversely, what stories already surround the issue? Because rarely, if ever, are you just launching an initiative into a neutral space. There are existing actors, narratives, actions, news events happening every day that are coloring the context of what you're trying to do, whether we like that or not. So we have to be prepared for both. And there's a case study from my portfolio that I find helpful in demonstrating this balance. So in 2019, we were approached by a coalition of criminal justice advocates. It was a mix of funders in the space, grassroots organizations, some institutional like think tanks, lawyers, and they were working to advance a bail reform package in New York State. And broadly speaking, not verbatim, but just generally their messaging platform was the idea that a person's level of wealth shouldn't impact their justice outcomes. So on its face, a very valid and viable messaging platform, very American, nonpartisan, kind of speaks to values that we're all meant to be after in a justice-oriented society. And they actually were able to pass their package. What was considered a quite progressive reform package was passed in New York State, and it was a celebratory moment for advocates and lawmakers who had been working towards it. What happened afterwards, however, was that there was basically a counter-narrative attack, I don't know, it might be dramatic to say smear campaign, but there was some very strong ideas proliferated in the media and by opposed political groups about what this would mean for society. So they were using the kinds of narrative tactics that you encounter a lot when you're dealing with social issues. So some racialized language. It's kind of widely understood that in our society, the idea of who is dangerous is closely linked to basically how Black you are. And that's colloquially true, but it's also true in legal settings where you sometimes see judges assessing like who is going to be put on cash bail based on how dangerous they seem. And there's a direct racial correlation there. There was also messaging that kind of played on the heightened emotional context of all criminal justice conversations. Whenever you're talking about crime, you're pressing on those buttons of fear, safety, violence, things that are really, really primal and limbic to people that cause them to have certain perceptions on that very base emotional survival-based level. And so this went on following the passing of the package, and sadly the outcome was that in the public, favorability for the reforms fell. When our coalition was doing their analysis of kind of polling sentiment, comparing how people felt after this media activity compared to how they felt before, favorability for bail reform had fallen not only just to what it was, but below what it was before they won. And then unfortunately, there were rollbacks of the package. And I think now it's in kind of like a middling place where you're seeing some judges have moved away from the use of cash bail, but you definitely still see the patterns and correlations in terms of certain groups being disproportionately impacted by it. And so I appreciate this example because even though it was a very painful and frustrating loss, both for that coalition and for the people in New York who are impacted by this, it really speaks to the idea of needing to think offensively and defensively, because this wasn't an example of a legal failure. The work was done, the buy-in was achieved, they were able to pass their package. And it wasn't even an example of a proactive and offensive messaging failure, because again, they got to where they needed to go. But the culprit was this kind of backlash, this counter narrative, lots of it rife with mis and disinformation that's informed by biases and cultural tensions. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not rolling all the way up on the screen, or if you're able to maybe recenter it. Thank you. But it was the kind of defensive, the stories that already surrounded the issue that this particular group wasn't particularly well strategized to combat. And so they really didn't have any narrative runway when that started happening, and they lost their favorability relatively quickly compared to how much work it took to get there. So with this group, we wound up making them a thinking tool You might have seen the design thinking iceberg. It kind of links external events to deeper mental models and beliefs. We made a communications variation for this group for use in systemic storytelling, because when we were kind of doing our post-loss analysis of what had happened and where some of the narrative momentum had been lost, one of the insights that we returned to again and again was this idea that when people don't have systemic context and understanding for a system, they're more susceptible to believe biased, mis and disinformation as a sort of stopgap in that understanding. And so we wanted to encourage this coalition who, like a lot of advocates, their background is not in communications. You know, their background is not in storytelling at scale or cultural influence or anything like that, but just in the current era, the way our media ecosystem works, it's imperative to be prepared to think that way. So we made them this tool to remind them to kind of think through the layers, that maybe there are opportunities to have a narrative strategy that responds not just to by the time you get to the news or media item that a consumer is going to see, but you've actually taken them on a journey of understanding about how that connects to policies and institutions and origins, including biased and harmful cultural origins, so that by the time they encounter a news item, they have a little bit more systemic literacy to be able to better assess what they're seeing and not be sensationalized, particularly in harmful ways. And that is actually, that tool and a couple of other ones are actually available as a public resource with worksheets and things like that if you want to experiment with putting messaging plans through that framework. So the second thing that we're usually looking at is messaging as an ethical practice. So standards around storytelling in general, but particularly in social impact-oriented work, are changing, and the heat's kind of being turned up for a higher standard and level of accountability, to move away from doing work for social good in kind of a careless way to making sure that the approach of telling those stories is as positive and constructive as the outcomes that we're seeking. So here the question that we're essentially asking ourselves is, how do we do perception change work, narrative change work, or storytelling in a values-aligned way? Because certainly there are tactics that are effective that are not values-aligned from a human rights and dignity perspective. You can emotionally manipulate people. You can use biased narratives to kind of shortcut people to a belief system, but that's not how we want to work. So how do we do it in a values-aligned way? And there's a lot of thinking about this, so I'm going to share a non-exhaustive list of best practices. I'm just kind of distilling what I think the core tenets are and what I see again and again. Broadly, witness, collaborate, honor, and evolve. So I'll go through what I mean by each of those. So witness is simply cultivating a tolerance for telling the truth. You might have heard from past movements that phrase, speak truth to power. That is an imperative element of advocacy communications and just being an advocate in general. You are not willing to incur at least a fraction of the risk that vulnerable communities face just by existing in your storytelling, meaning you're going to tell the whole story, like all of the relevant context of why something is the way it is, meaning if there's an actor who's done something questionable, even if they're powerful, in a way that feels respectful and appropriate to you, you're going to state that plainly. You're going to have a really hard time advocating for anyone because that's the heart of it. So witnessing is imperative. And there are ways, what I appreciate about this era is that because everybody's challenging themselves to tell stories more ethically, you're seeing that there are ways to do this without necessarily being, again, sensational or confrontational. Just very realistically, that's not an appropriate stance for many people, most organizations, and it's not a very sustainable one. We can't constantly be in a state of conflict. And so just as an example, I appreciate the place that the ACLU has gotten to with their storytelling approach and their brand voice. It's unequivocal, it's very direct, it draws a hard line in where they perceive a violation in standards, but it's not unduly confrontational. They're not ranting at anybody, they're not potentially alienating people via their communication. If your value set is not aligned, you might feel alienated, but the communication itself is not harming their chances of constructive outcomes. So I think that's a good example. And then witnessing is also powerful in my experience when it's done through a balance of quantitative and qualitative insights. This was a publication and a campaign that we did a few years ago with the Immigration and Criminal Justice Advocacy Group, Forward.us. They had a large body of research about the impact of mass incarceration, and especially over-incarceration, on American families. And what I appreciated was their commitment going into the campaign to making sure that it wasn't just a barrage of statistics. Because again, that context and that color and that opportunity for seeding empathy and human emotion, that's going to come out more on the qualitative side. And so the woman you see here, although she looks perfect like a stock image, she's actually a staffer at Forward, and she very bravely shared her personal story of involvement, her family's involvement in the carceral system, and really took that witnessing to a quite personal level in ways that set the tone for the whole campaign. So collaborate. This is about making sure that you're not always sitting in a posture of telling stories about others, but actually including system-impacted community voices and perspectives on your team so that you're telling stories with one another. And just a quick example of what that could look like. This is a group that I've worked with called the Just Trust. They're also criminal justice advocacy. And they were preparing to launch their first ever campaign as a new organization. And so it would have been a really easy move to do a sort of institutional top-down, here's who we are, and here's our worldview, and here's what we think, and what have you. And that would have been fine, but they were really committed to bringing in the voices from their grassroots community. And because they'd already laid the groundwork of building those relationships beforehand, we were able to invite them into a collaborative space and give them a platform to use their voices in the campaign and create content that benefited both sides. So these organizations that don't necessarily have the resources of a huge philanthropy got some storytelling assets out of it, and the philanthropy got to really seed space and expertise to people on the ground. And similar to the last example, that had a positive ripple effect in the campaign itself, because when people in the target states saw this content and saw folks who felt very accessible and very close to them, they then jumped into the comments and started to indicate that they saw themselves in these things, and you start to get that sense of positive peer-to-peer influence to advance the messages that you need to. Two more, almost done. The second to last one is honor. And this is just really about a reminder to always portray every subject of your story with as much dignity as possible. This is it's difficult. It's difficult for lifelong advocates because there's this tension between wanting to indicate how bad a situation is, how dire a crisis is, but also not wanting to paint people in a pejorative way as though they are inept, as though their identities are completely flattened into the negative system impacts that they're living with, which is very dehumanizing and very undignified. And again, we want to move away from the theme is human rights, but the process is shaky. We want it to feel really respectful throughout. And something we've been noticing, this is from a recent landscape analysis we did of communications across different development and crisis response organizations. If you compare this kind of visual communication to 20, even 10, maybe even 5 years ago, it's quite different. You're seeing people who look strong, who look competent. You're not just seeing people literally embody destitution just because they're negatively impacted by systems like war, climate change, political corruption, what have you. And so I'm really respecting that the sector is working to strike that balance and look for different means of encouraging empathy and support for different communities. And the last one is to evolve. And this is just acknowledging that no set of best practices that I or anybody could give you today is going to be relevant, I would say in 10 years, but with the way culture moves now, it's probably 2 years. It's really imperative that you each of us stay plugged into what are the emerging voices that hadn't been heard before, what are the new practices, what's innovative in how we tell stories around the work that we're advocating for. So just a couple of movements that are on my radar. Solutions journalism as a movement, and then also as a network. Those first couple of screenshots are from the Solutions Journalism Network. Genevieve alluded to this as well, but there's just a need to balance out reporting on problems and hardship with uplifting the innovations and the solutions and the steps forward, even if they're relatively small, advances forward among our target audiences, because that's the part that's going to spark the next wave of innovation so that we can get out of just exchanging punditry and statistics about the same problems and actually solving the problems. So we have to make sure we're maintaining that messaging balance where if you're sharing doom and gloom, you're also sharing, but where do we see hope? Where do we see advancement? And that's also a way of dignifying and honoring the folks impacted by systems negatively, because usually those are the cutting edge innovators of those advancements. And then another thing on my radar, a colleague shared this the other day and I thought it was great, just this movement to decolonize journalism. So this woman lives and works in the Amazon and is looking to set a new standard in storytelling that actually centers the perspective of people who live and work there as well. And her anecdote is really a powerful example. She said that she could imagine a Western journalist coming in and seeing somebody fishing and being like, oh my God, you're so poor, and projecting this entire narrative on this community member, whereby by the community standards, that person might see themselves as rich. And so it's a small anecdote, but it's a reminder that none of us can ever get to a place where we assume that our ingoing perception is the default and the ultimate truth. We have to always stay curious about the perspectives of people on the ground and make sure that we're uplifting as much authenticity as possible. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ricky Gaines, and I work as the Senior Human Rights Advocacy Manager at the Wikimedia Foundation. And today I'll talk to you a little bit about how we do advocacy and why we do advocacy and some instances where we've been advocating for certain things. But before I get started, I just wanted to ask for a quick show of hands. Who here has ever used Wikipedia? All right. Who here has edited Wikipedia? All right. Okay. All right. That's more than I thought. Who here has ever been threatened by the authorities for accessing or editing Wikipedia? That's what I thought. So the Wikimedia Foundation, we're the nonprofit organization that is behind Wikipedia and other free knowledge projects. We support a global movement that shares a vision of a world in which every single person can share in the sum of all knowledge. The free knowledge movement, of which the Wikimedia Foundation is just a small part, seeks to ensure that everyone everywhere can access reliable, trustworthy information without barriers and free of charge. To this end, we support the needs of a vibrant, self-governed community of more than 300,000 active editors who contribute to Wikipedia by adding, editing, moderating content to over 55 million articles in over 300 languages. This is the only slide I have for you today. I thought it kind of represents what we're about. I work on our global advocacy team, which is a new team to the foundation. And we have a mantra that we use throughout the work week. It's protect the model, protect the people, and protect the values. So the first photo is just a gathering of Wikimedians. So Wikimedian is anybody that contributes to Wikipedia or any of our Wikimedia projects at a 2014 gathering in London called Wikimania. And this kind of represents the community-led model that we are working to protect. And this gentleman is Mark Bernstein, who's a Belarusian Wikipedian, who I'd like to talk a little bit about today. He kind of represents the people of our movement that we're protecting. The founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, commented recently that 20 years ago when he started Wikipedia, he never thought people would be arrested for contributing to an encyclopedia. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Mark Bernstein is a Russian language Wikipedian. He's a volunteer based in Belarus. He's one of the top 50 editors in Russian language Wikipedia, and where he's contributed more than 200,000 edits, which is kind of a big deal. Early in 2020, around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mark's Wikipedia account, social media accounts, and work address were doxxed, which means they were shared publicly with the intent to intimidate him and to elicit threats against him. They were doxxed on the public Telegram channel of a Belarusian law enforcement agency. Authorities shortly thereafter detained Mark and published a video of the arrest and photograph of him in the same channel, stating that he was distributing fake anti-Russian information. I think you can see where I'm going with this. They did not state the official charges that led to his detention. He was initially sentenced to jail for about 15 days for disobeying law enforcement, but then was detained for over 3 months without any sort of explanation. In June 2022, the authorities failed a second time to state any charges, but found him guilty of organizing and preparing activities that disrupt the social order. Since then, Mark was condemned to live for 3 years in conditions of restricted freedom, where he must be home at specified hours, can't engage in certain activities, and is prohibited from leaving the country. Other Wikipedians like Mark continue to face threats from authoritarian governments and other malicious actors who object to the content they write or edit on Wikipedia. Though most people don't really associate Wikipedia with human rights, our movement believes that knowledge is power and that knowledge is a human right. Free knowledge, I know you are all familiar with human rights, so I don't really have to spell this out to you, but I will. Free knowledge, along with the fundamental right to freedom of expression, empowers people to exercise many other fundamental rights, including the rights to education, artistic expression, economic development, and civic and political participation. When people have access to good information, they become more involved citizens, they make more informed decisions, they build more just societies, they build deeper and foster deeper connections among each other, and are capable of experiencing greater levels of development in terms of education, equality, health, and just general well-being. In December 2021, the Wikimedia Foundation reaffirmed its commitment to upholding and protecting the rights of all those who use Wikipedia, ranging from committed volunteers to casual users, like many of us in this room. We carry out these commitments to upholding and protecting our community's human rights through 4 primary activities. The first one is conducting ongoing human rights due diligence, including conducting periodic human rights impact assessments. So this is just a fancy way of saying, we look to identify and analyze potential human rights risks and harms on our platforms so we can mitigate them before they occur. We also track and publicly report on our efforts to meet these human rights commitments. We use our influence with civil society partners, the private sector, and governments to advance and uphold respect for human rights and law. And we provide access to effective remedy when human rights harms have occurred. Our human rights commitments ultimately seek to protect our volunteers, sustain our movement, and to better achieve our shared mission. So how have we been meeting these human rights commitments? Well, over the past couple of years, we've increased our human rights muscle, as we call it, by recruiting more staff with human rights expertise. We've carried out 3 human rights impact assessments since 2020 and plan to continue doing more human rights due diligence in the future in order to understand our overall impact as a movement, the impact we're having on specific groups like children and their rights, and the impacts that specific tools and projects can have on our users and communities' freedom of expression and privacy. To the extent possible, we strive to publish these reports in order to demonstrate transparency and in order to have kind of a frank, honest conversation with our movement about what the risks are and how we can all work to address them. We publish twice annual transparency reports to the public so that we can tell you how many government requests we have received for user data or to take down or alter content on specific Wikipedia pages and how we have responded to those. Actually, just this week, we released our most recent, so I encourage you to Google Wikimedia Transparency Report, and you can learn more about it. Spoiler alert, we don't usually grant a lot of these requests because we are very adamant that we're going to protect our community's privacy and freedom of expression. We also advocate for laws and regulations that keep the internet an open environment where community-led projects like ours can thrive, and for laws that uphold human rights principles online. We also consult frequently with members of our community to learn about the threats that they are seeing and experiencing and what sorts of resources that they need to protect themselves. And finally, whenever there's a crisis situation, we respond to support our volunteers whose rights are being harmed or threatened in these crisis situations, including during the conflict in Ukraine. Since the topic of today's panel is messaging for social change, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we message and how we conduct advocacy at the Wikimedia Foundation. Fundamentally, we are looking to build a global movement and sustain a global movement for the volunteers that make free knowledge possible. Our projects, all of them everywhere, face an evolving legal environment in both open democratic societies, but also in more closed authoritarian contexts. We advocate for policies that support privacy, flexible copyright, free expression, and laws that allow people to freely contribute to our projects. Our community, again, is kind of the lifeblood of what we do. We work to mobilize these communities and like-minded civil society organizations and coalitions to achieve our shared objectives. We do this by meeting with lawmakers, engaging with the media, and other kind of policy influencers is what we call them, to help them understand how our unique model works, how it contributes to stronger societies, and how proposed laws can diminish our users' rights and the benefits that Wikipedia afford, the broader communities. Of course, because we're an organization that is headquartered in the United States and we have a lot of exposure to US laws and are subject to legal jurisdiction here, we do focus a lot of our advocacy efforts on the US government. A few areas that we're prioritizing in the US right now include copyright, which maybe is not like the most sexy human rights topic, but we talk about it a lot. Section 512 of the US Copyright Act establishes a notice and takedown regime that balances copyright enforcement with legitimate free speech interests. And it also helps mitigate platforms having to proactively take stuff down, which can result in platforms inadvertently taking down things that have every right to be in the public domain. We're also working a lot on what are called intermediary liability protections. As lawyers or aspiring lawyers, you can all probably know more about this than I do. So intermediary liability protections are essential for platforms to be able to protect community governance, community editing, and content moderation models by protecting the platforms from liability for content that users post on those platforms. So if somebody posts something that is, that violates copyright laws on Wikipedia, we can't be sued by whatever studio owns that, because that would make it hard for us to stay in business as a nonprofit. Section 230 of the U.S. Communications Decency Act establishes these protections, but it's been increasingly under threat from legislators that are interested in amending it or repealing it altogether. And so we're trying to advocate hard for maintaining Section 230 in the U.S. We're also very concerned by mass surveillance. Mass surveillance robs audiences and contributors of privacy, safety, and their freedom of expression online. And later this year, the program that authorizes these activities in the U.S., Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, is to be reauthorized, which offers us an opportunity to get in front of lawmakers and talk about opportunities to kind of narrow the scope of of this law. It's interesting that Kat actually showed the tweet from the ACLU talking about this and suing the NSA because we are actively involved in that project too, because it is something that threatens the privacy of our communities. Even though we're based in the US, we serve a global audience, and laws in other countries and regions can also have a big effect on our community's human rights. So we do our advocacy work internationally as well. Last year, the Wikimedia Foundation, along with a coalition of other like-minded organizations, successfully advocated for the US and UK governments to narrow, or to clarify rather, the scope of sanctions that were being proposed to punish the Russian government for its illegal invasion of Ukraine. We did this because the lack of clarity in the sanctions basically would have made it impossible for telecommunications companies to continue to provide access to the open internet to the Russian people. So these sanctions could have had the unintended consequence of harming their freedom of expression and kind of the last outlet for reliable, honest information for Russian citizens. We've also worked with our affiliate organization in Chile to raise concerns over proposed legislation to regulate online platforms in Chile. This obviously would have had an impact in Chile, but it could have had a broader impact throughout Latin America as well, so we thought it was important to weigh in. We worked with Chilean lawmakers to raise concerns about ambiguous definitions in the legislation, the unintended impacts it could have had for community-led content moderation models like we have at Wikimedia, and a lack of consideration for just other platforms. Governments tend to regulate thinking that all online platforms are kind of like the big ones that we all know. I won't name them, but they don't realize that there's actually a really big diversity of how online platforms and communities work. We also joined a coalition of civil society organizations that successfully advocated for President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines to veto the SIM card Registration Act, which would have required users of social media platforms, and again, potentially Wikipedia because the definitions were vague, to use their real identities and phone numbers to register accounts. It would have criminalized online anonymity, and it would have penalized platforms that refused to disclose users' private data. When we're looking at laws and regulations around the world that could affect our projects, our community of volunteers, they're really our eyes and ears on the ground worldwide. And they're the ones that are best suited to understand the local political context, the cultural nuances, and to meet with policymakers and to lead advocacy efforts. As a protagonist of our movement, we work to elevate their stories, their voices, and their power to bring change that supports our shared vision of a world in which every human being can participate in the sum of all knowledge. To this end, we're working to equip volunteers with the tools and skills they need to lead advocacy efforts in their home countries and to stay safe from the threats I talked about earlier. As you can tell, our movement is really busy defending free knowledge and human rights globally. And these challenges, they're really dynamic. They change every day with new bills that are emerging, new technologies, or just kind of the whims of authoritarian regimes around the world. So thank you for inviting me to speak to you about open knowledge and human rights, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all so much. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions? Yes.
Thank you all for speaking today. I appreciate it.
You could introduce yourself also briefly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Navadia. I use she pronouns. I'm a freshman at Duke here, undergrad. And so you all spoke a lot about equal inclusion in communications, non-human rights work, and in a way I'm on the other end of that as someone who needs to be able to tell their story around issues that we're facing. So for context, I will be at this year's UN Women Conference. It's called CSW. It's addressing many of the topics you're speaking to, which is Section 230 and content moderation. And I'll be in a negotiating room, legislators that are many, many years older than me. And I just wanted to ask you, especially frustration that I feel around gender-based violence, which is the advocacy issue that we're talking about during this conference, and balance that with backgrounds that the policymakers and negotiators will be coming from. You know, like I think I'm 18 years old, so I'll be in a space where people have very different life experiences from me. So if you could speak to negotiate or how do you communicate with people that may not carry the same life experiences, and how do you appeal to, how can I appeal to those?
Thank you for that. Let me just, if there are any other questions, and we can take them combined since we have limited time. Any other questions?
Well, in the first place, I would say try not to discount yourself on the basis of your age. Some of the tipping points of social movements that have been most transformative have been led by young people. You have valid lived experiences and perspectives. You have a contextual, historic perspective that those people don't have. You are your age in 2023. So try not to see it as lesser perspective. It's just different perspective. And then I would say, if there are ways for you, some of this I kind of touched on before, but if there are ways for you to cultivate a story that balances like quant and qual, so to speak. So if you can share an anecdote, whether it's you're comfortable doing it from your own life or from your own work, or something that really personalizes the tensions and the negative impacts that you're talking about, and then scale it out using more of the statistics, more of like what are the harms and negative ripple effects that we see at scale. Those two things together should provide complementary entry points for someone to engage with it. You don't know, to your point, you don't know like what's gonna move your audience exactly. Some people are gonna hear the personal anecdote and it's really gonna strike something within them and you know, spark a new level of commitment. Some people are maybe going to be like, okay, about the anecdote, but then when you start to take them on the journey of like, and here's what those impacts look like, these are the negative impacts they have on your constituencies, your society, the world as a whole, everyone has a vested interest in prosperity, or they should. So just think about how you can make a sort of holistic appeal on the basis of those two things.
I would also add, don't overestimate how much policymakers know. They have incredibly broad portfolios that cover a lot of topics that are of national and sometimes international importance. And, you know, they're only human and they can't be experts on everything. So when you walk into a meeting with policymakers, trust in your own expertise because you've probably done a lot of research and have really deep expertise about the thing that you want to talk about. And so you maybe, you know, the person across the table does know exactly what you want to talk about. And you can have a more kind of fluid conversation like that. But go in there prepared to do a little bit of explaining. And then I always found that having a story to kind of bring these like high level, vague or concepts back down to earth with a story about how it affects somebody or how it affects you is a good way to kind of bring it home and make them walk away remembering that conversation.
Genevieve, did you want to add anything?
Hey, sorry, I wasn't able to hear the question.
Do you want to give a quick recap of your question?
It's just that the mic doesn't pick it up properly.
Yeah, sort of thinking about, so this is a student who's going to be attending CSW and working around issues of gender and gender-based violence and being in a room of policymakers and sort of how to highlight her own experience and perspectives in light of some of those, I guess, power differentials and other issues with policymakers.
Thanks for recapping that. I mean, I think that's an amazing opportunity, first of all, and I am a bit jealous. But I think, you know, like others have said, you know, the multitude of perspectives is so important. And when I spoke about, you know, having a nuanced story around what it is we're talking about, in my case, migration, I think it applies everywhere. You know, everyone experiences things differently. And the impacts on human rights can be different depending on a multitude of reasons. And so having that richness brought to policymakers is really part of the beauty of that process. And I think I haven't worked with CSW myself, but I've worked with CEDAW in the past, and they really appreciated, people coming from the country where we were working to share what were the different stories, what were the different experiences people were facing based on, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, anything that can help them understand what does it actually look like in real life, and how do we then translate that into policy making is really at the heart of good policy making. So I really hope you can benefit from that experience yourself, but also help them understand what it is that you and other people are experiencing in your day-to-day. So yeah, good luck.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you again to our 3 speakers for being here today as well.